This evening to turn with me over in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 30. Sometimes recently as I've been looking at Proverbs from time to time and looking to build a message, a lot of times, in the New Testament and other books of the Bible, you can have long portions of Scripture to work with and lay out there and read the context and everything. But Proverbs, you can't always do that because Proverbs are full of these little short jabs, just one-liners sometimes. And but we have a portion here, and I'd like for you in chapter 30. And verse 1 says, the words of Agur, the son of Jaketh, even the prophecy, the man spake unto Ithiel, even unto Ithiel and Ucal. And so these are the words of Agur. And he has, in Proverbs, these are short, pithy sayings. And the idea is that they're short, but they're full of thought. There's a lot of deep thinking that goes into each of these little short sayings. And we want to look at a portion here in chapter 30, in verse 24. Beginning with verse 24, we actually get several verses here. Verse 24 through verse 28. There be four things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise. The ants are of people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. The conies are but a feeble folk, yet make they their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet go they forth all of them by bands. The spider taketh hold with her hands, and is in kings' palaces. And we want to look at this little lesson here this evening on wisdom. And we see here, he said there be four things. He said they're small, they're insignificant in the world. No. He goes on, he talks another about things that go well, and that one being the line, and that's a whole other train of thought. But here he's talking about, said, here's four things. They're small. They're insignificant in a lot of ways. Easy to overlook. Yet, for all their smallness, he says they are exceeding wise. The ant, the coney, the locust, and the spider. Now, three of these, well, two of them actually are insects. The spider is not truly an insect. The distinction being insects have 6 legs and the spider has 8. They're in a class by themselves, but still they're related. But a coney is a type of rabbit that dwells in the rocks. And these four things are set before us as examples of wisdom. God, and as we look at each of these, we understand that this wisdom is something that is given to them by God. It's created into them. It is not necessarily something that where they observe and they learn and they change their habits and so on and so forth, like we have to do. We have to learn wisdom, and that's the reason they're here. God has given us teachers. He's given us things in nature to teach us to be wise. And we are to observe, and we can observe these things, and we can learn to be wise. And we need to, to learn to be wise. So, we talk about wisdom. We talk about being wise. There's a lot of things I find myself, in sermons that I'll touch upon. And we'll talk about, making right decisions. But then we don't talk about what some of those decisions are. Next Sunday, we intend to do that. We talk about wisdom. But like a lot of things, wisdom has to be applied in specific things. And so we see in these examples of wisdom that we are to observe, that we can observe in nature and the study of God's creation, and we can learn from them. First of all, we see the wisdom of the ant. The wisdom of the ant. It said ants are a people not strong, maybe not compared to larger creatures, but from my understanding, for their size, ants are very strong. But they're tiny. But yet we see they are given as an example of wisdom here in their gathering and preparing, said, their meat in summer. Said they're not very strong, yet they prepare their meat in summer. The wisdom of the ant is seen in its preparations, its self-discipline, its self-motivation, and how it makes provision for the future. Notice, if you will, in Proverbs 6:6, somebody else also kind of commented on the ant as an example and incentive to those who have a tendency to be lazy. You know anybody that has a tendency to be lazy? I think we all have that tendency from time to time anyway. Some people maybe more than others. And we need to overcome that tendency. And so in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 6, he says, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise." Now see, here again, the ant is set forth as an example of wisdom. And the example here goes exactly along with what in our text he's talking about. "Consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in summer and gathereth her food in the harvest." In other words, winter is coming. And the ant goes forth and makes provision and gathers in food and makes preparation for the winter when there is no food to be had. And there's a lot of examples of this, but the ant in particular is given. And especially the idea, it says, having no guide or overseer or ruler. Now the ant, as we said, these things are created within the ant by God. They're given to the ant by God because it is necessary for its survival. God, on the other hand, has not given us that innate, natural tendency to do it. Maybe when we was first created, probably did. But because of sin, because of the fall, because of the corruption of our nature, when left to ourselves, we tend to be lazy. And that's the example here. It said, having no root, no one to stand over the ant and tell it. Now you got to go out there today and gather in food and make preparation for the winter. The ant just does it. And so part of the example, the wisdom of the ant is that self-discipline. The self-motivation. Personally, I need a lot of external motivation. I need a wife sometimes to tell me, honey, you need to get up and go take out the trash. You need to, to do this, you need to do that. I get so distracted and so caught up in studying or drawing or doing something else that's my focus. And if somebody doesn't come along and nudge me and tell me, you need to go do this, you need to go do that, I need a lot of external motivation. But we need to learn, and I admire people that are really self-disciplined, self-motivated. You hear about those kind of people. They're generally type A personalities. They're the achievers, the go-getters, and so on. I tend to be more of the laid-back, take it easy persuasion. Anyway, but we see in the ant this example, and we need to learn that. And that's the thing, that God does give us the ability to learn and to acquire new habits, to acquire and learn new skills. And so we need to learn to be more self-motivated, self-disciplined, and not depend upon others to come along and give us a good swift kick in the seat of the pants or something to get us moving. Now the thing is, if we discipline ourselves, if we motivate ourselves, then we won't need that kind of external motivation. But if that's what we need, God will provide it. He provides what we need. And if we need motivation, and need external motivation, He'll provide it, one way or another. But the wisdom is that of the ant, and that of making provision for the future, looking to the future, seeing what is going to be needed, and making those preparations and getting the things done necessary to meet that future need, or to provide for the future. In a spiritual application, in Matthew chapter 6, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, it says, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We need to have the view of life and how temporary and short-term this life in this world is, and eternity. And we have the opportunity, God has given to us the opportunity to lay up, to lay by in store, to lay ahead for ourselves treasures or riches, provisions in eternity. And to to have that desire within us and that motivation within us, to have that vision and to apply this, that we may, he says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Don't just labor. Don't just put forth your labor for the things that you can have and use now, but those things that you will have in eternity, that will last forever. You know, the things that we can collect and accumulate and lay up for ourselves now are only temporary. They're going to rust, they're going to wear out, they're going to, sometimes people just work and scrape and save and everything for this new car. There's some car, it's just their dream car, this is what they want, and they just work and scrape and save for it. But it's going to rust. It's going to wear out. The paint's going to chip. There's all sorts of things. Somebody can steal it. You can leave it parked and somebody can run into it. These things are only temporary. And what God is saying is, don't just focus on these temporary things that you can accumulate for yourselves now that you enjoy. You may enjoy having that car. You may enjoy driving it around. But there are things that when we get to heaven, we're going to enjoy. Heaven's not going to be a boring place. It's not going to be some place where we're just going to sit around twiddling our thumbs. We will have things there that we can enjoy. And the way that we obtain those things that we will have and enjoy and use throughout eternity is by how we live and conduct ourselves now. And in our service for God, in our devotion to Him, in doing those things that we should be doing, we are laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And we can learn a lesson, a valuable lesson, from the ant, and observe the ant. When we have that tendency to be lazy, the Bible here, Proverbs, that's some of that external motivation. When God, through the writer of the Proverbs here, says, "Thou sluggard, go look at the ant." Observe her ways, learn. Don't be lazy. That's the wisdom of the ant. The wisdom of the conies, the rock rabbit. I'd chew on that one a little bit. Some of these, you really have to stop and think about. Maybe you can come up with some things too as you think about them and meditate upon them. But the example is given. He said, there are feeble folk. Think, a little rabbit. They're not a strong animal. They're not a vicious animal. They're not a hunter or something like. They're a feeble. A little bunny rabbit, cute, adorable. They're feeble. The scriptural term used here applied to them. It said, yet they make their houses, they make their home in the rocks. You heard the phrase between a rock and a hard spot? That's where they're at home. What was that old fable about Brer Rabbit and the briar patch? That's where he made his home. You got to think about that. And the idea that he's an example here of one who is wise. I thought of what Jesus said, the wise man built his house upon a rock. The wise man built his house upon a rock. And so the wisdom here in the coney or the rabbit, the rock rabbit, is this choice of where to build his home. Now again, these things are that natural instinct that God has given them, but He's given them to us as an example to observe and learn. Because, the rock affords protection. The rocks, are a good place of defense against predators. And as a child of God, we have some predators. We have an adversary. And we need to build our house, that is our life, upon the rock, which is Jesus Christ. People, there's all sorts of books out there, self-help books, motivational books, people telling you how to live and how to be successful and all these other things. If you truly want to be successful in life, you need to build that life upon a solid foundation, and that is Jesus Christ. There's no way around it. There's no alternative. There's no substitute for building your life upon the foundation and the rock of Jesus Christ. When Christ came to build His house, to build His church, the house of God, which is the church of the living God, He built it upon the rock. He said, upon this rock I will build my church. Why? Because there is a solid foundation which will not be moved. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. That is, upon the flesh, upon the wisdom of men, upon the ideas and teachings of men, upon catering to the desires of the flesh, whatever. Those things change. That sand is constantly moving. You've seen some of these movies and things about the desert and the wind blowing and how it's constantly shifting and changing shapes, and you can't, landmarks, there's no such thing because they move. They change. In a changing time, a changing world, and everything else has changed. There are no absolutes. The philosophies of life where there's no absolutes, everything is relative. Then you have no solid foundation upon which to base your life, your choices, your decisions. But Christ is a solid foundation, and He gives us absolutes upon which we can be absolutely certain His words are true. And so we see in the coney here and the wisdom of building His house upon the rock. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, notice too, the Apostle Paul. He says they're feeble folk, these rock rabbits, these conies. So they're feeble folk. Notice what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26. For you see your calling, brethren, not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in His presence. Feeble folk, not very strong, not very wise, not, in any of that the world looks upon that outward appearance. That no flesh should glory in His presence. And yet God uses those very things to bring to nothing all that the world looks upon and thinks of as valuable, mighty, noble, whatever. Those things will come to nothing. Those things will amount to nothing. But God's people that serve Him will ultimately be used of God. And we have in Him a source of strength, a source of comfort, a source of protection that is mightier than any adversary that we might have. Thirdly, we see the wisdom of the locust. Now this one in particular I had a hard time with. Wisdom of the locust. That the wisdom is seen again in the fact that they have no king. They have no ruler. They have no one to order them, so to speak. Yet, as it say here, the locusts have no king, yet go they forth, all of them by bands. That is, the word there is gathered together. And when I looked that word up and saw its meaning, then, okay, well, I've got something to work with there. Gathered together. You know, and to me, it talks about the Lord's church. We're gathered together. It's an assembly of saints. And we have no earthly king. We have no earthly headquarters. You see? We have no external organization. But through God's Spirit there is unity. Ephesians chapter 4. In verse 1 he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called, with all lowliness and meekness, with long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, even as you are called, and one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all, and through all, and in you all. But unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Now I'm talking about the unity of the Spirit. And every child of God, the Spirit of God dwells in us and teaches us the same thing. There is a unity that comes from within, that is not forced upon us from without. It is a unity, not a conformity, if you understand the distinction I'm trying to make. Where we were there in Pierce County in Washington, there was a particular organization, a so-called church. They call themselves the New Testament Church. But everybody in the community knew it as the Compound Church. They had this compound, they had their church building, they had their school, the people lived there. Outsiders go in, they were met with people with guns, literally. And every man went twice a month and got a haircut. Their hair all had to be a certain length. The women's hair had to be a certain length. There was just, the women wore, and there's nothing wrong. And I believe that women ought to have long hair. Men ought to keep their hair cut short. Women, women's dress, I believe those things. But we should be led by the Spirit that is in us to be in agreement to do those things, not forced on us externally that we conform to a certain image that someone else has come up with. There's a big difference. Unity versus conformity. And we see here in the example of the locusts a unity without the need for an external conformity. And there's wisdom in that. God in His wisdom, when He instituted His church, and each church is an autonomous body of believers that are gathered together in that location to worship Him, and we see that through the Spirit that dwells in each one of us, brings us into unity. That we might have the wisdom to follow the Lord, if you will, in scriptural baptism. To place our light upon that lampstand, to be a member of one of His churches, to gather together with God's people, and to be in unity with God's people. There is wisdom in that. And then finally, the wisdom of the spider. Now, all these creatures, you think the spider can go, but, well, the spider was popularized and made acceptable and cute by the Charlotte's Web, the story. But anyway, in the Scripture, the spider is given to us, again, as one of those examples in nature, one of those little things that is exceedingly wise. The wisdom of the spider is seen, first of all, in the spider's industry. That is, it's busy. It says, she taketh hold with her hands. Obviously it's talking about the spinning of the web and so on. But she taketh hold of that work. She works and labors away. And we see also a recognition of that labor and industry rewarded. Here's this little creature, this insignificant thing, despised perhaps, but where do you find it? You find it in the king's palace. It's one of the things that you find them everywhere. But here particularly, it's identifying, we kind of look down on the spider, we look down upon this little creature, but you will find this little creature in the king's palace. It's a humble creature, and yet we find it in exalted places. And I believe the lesson here is that if we learn to humble ourselves and we persevere about the Lord's work and just keep on keeping on, God will reward us. God will exalt us. Notice Proverbs 16. This bit of wisdom said, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. How many times I have seen literally that fulfilled, as well as spiritually or symbolically. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5. Yeah. Likewise, you younger, I didn't read down far enough to, that was my thought there. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, likewise, you younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. And so we see here, he says, humble yourselves one to another. All of you. This is something we all need to do, to humble ourselves one to another, because God resisteth the proud. When we exalt ourselves, God will, by some means, humiliate us. But if we would humble ourselves, then God will in due season exalt us. And that is his promise here. So humble yourselves, therefore, under the leadership, under the word, the instructions, the leading of God to do his will, and he will exalt you. We see in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, it said, let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. And I think that's kind of the example of the spider. It says she taketh hold with her hands. There's the work to be done. God has given us a work to do. It's a good work. And we're to do it and to keep on doing it. So we see in the spider the perseverance, the persistence. There is the story out of Scotland when Robert the Bruce, who would be king of Scotland and would fought several battles with the English and was defeated. And one time after defeat, and he was hiding from the English, and he was in a barn, and he was laying there, and he happened to look up and he saw this spider. And the spider was trying to span its web from one beam to another. And it made several attempts to try to span that gap and failed. Robert was laying there watching it, but it kept trying, and it kept trying. And finally it made it. It succeeded and got the web across, and of course once it got across and got attached, how they'll build off of that and so on. And that example of that spider inspired him to try again. And he did. And he defeated the British, and Scotland gained its independence from England. And he became king of an independent Scotland. So there is wisdom in the spider. And part of that is the example of its persistence. And it persevered. And it keeps on. Just as he admonishes us here in the New Testament, we read And I believe this is an application of that. Don't grow weary in well-doing, because if we persevere, if we keep on, then we shall reap in due season. If we just humble ourselves and just keep on keeping on, God will exalt us. And just as Robert the Bruce was exalted from that stall in the barn and defeat to a king and a palace, you know, the spider makes his home in the palace. I bet there were some spiders in the palace there in Scotland, and every time Bruce would see one, he'd have to kind of grin to himself and nod his head and remember that in that barn, watching that spider and how it inspired him. The things that we can learn if we are just observant. And let us learn to be wise after the examples set before us. You know, Scriptures teach us, James says, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of the Lord, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. That is, he's not going to rebuke you for asking for wisdom. You know, he's not going to say, ha, you're admitting that you're stupid, huh? You're admitting that you're ignorant. No, he doesn't do that. He encourages us that when we realize a need, that we ask him to fulfill that need. If we lack wisdom, and that's the thing, he said, God has given us the capacity to learn and to acquire things that we do not have. And if we do not have the wisdom and the persistence and the different things that's set before us here of these four small creatures, but we ask God, Lord, help me to see what is the lesson here. Help me to, I see what I need here. I see that I need the strengths and the persistence and the humility and the faith and these different things, the wisdom. Lord, give me wisdom. He will. We can learn to be wise. And that's the reason he's given us these examples and given us the encouragement and given us the external motivation by the rebuke or of the word to learn, to be wise, to learn from these examples.